My name is Helen Carter, I'm 43, and I've dedicated over a decade to biomedical research. For me, science has always been more than a job. It's a passion demanding absolute precision and a relentless mind. That's why the betrayal I discovered that morning felt less like an emotional affront and more like a meticulous, almost clinical violation. I opened the hospital's website and saw the news that ignited my thoughts. The most prestigious award in the field had been given to Mark Lewis, my lab colleague, and, until then, research partner. The project that garnered the accolades wasn't his. It was mine. But my name wasn't there. He had stolen the credit, making public what I had conceived and developed in secret, night after night, amidst sequencing and biomarker analysis. I looked at the photos from the ceremony, where Mark displayed the trophy to applause, staring at the camera as if he were solely responsible for those discoveries. A chill ran through me, and the phrase repeated itself, clear and hard. They forgot the knowledge was mine. There was no room for sadness or uncontrolled rage, only the surgical precision of someone who understands the process and knows where the flaw that allowed the theft occurred. I vividly recalled the moment I handed over preliminary data, trusting in the ethics of a scientific environment. But, I must admit, Mark proved patient and strategic. He was present in all discussions, absorbing information and strengthening his position with management, while I remained focused on experiments, spreadsheets, and graphs. It wasn't an emotional betrayal, but a cold analysis of a premeditated act. I mentally reviewed each step, each conversation, each meeting where my name had been intentionally silenced. I also remembered the veiled complicity of the director, who smiled at Mark, and the sudden distancing of Sarah, a longtime friend, who gradually aligned herself with the victory that wasn't mine. At that moment, frustration was contained by strategy. My strength resided in knowledge. I had the original notes, the raw data, the genetic sequencing results, and concrete evidence of the project's authorship. They could present Mark as the winner, but that truth would never be erased. As the clock ticked away the impassive rhythm of the morning, I took a deep breath and prepared for what was to come. This was only the first move. The response, I knew, would require patience, analysis, and a calculated plan. They had underestimated a methodical woman who sees science as a territory where justice could be achieved not through emotion, but through logic. I closed the browser tab with the conviction that, in this battle, the stolen credit would be returned. And, even as many celebrated the false victory, I repeated to myself, with the firm voice of certainty, they forgot the knowledge was mine. It was a silent warning that the true path to power lay in that knowledge which, despite the theft, remained intact in my hands. The image that the hospital and many outside it had of Mark and me as scientific partners was a carefully constructed facade, but the truth was far more complex and darker. While he gained the admiration of his superiors, articulated smiles and sympathetic gestures for the spotlight, I delved into the faded details of the research, clinging to the belief that rigor, ethics, and merit would prevail. It was this trust that, for too long, blinded me to the signs of what was to come. At the beginning of our collaboration, Mark seemed like a dedicated, interested, even passionate colleague. I watched him absorb the content of our discussions, asking technical questions that weren't superficial, but rather the manifestation of a curious mind, eager to understand the complexities of sequencing and biomarker analysis. Many times, he sought my validation, and I, generous and trusting, felt we were moving forward together, that we were a team walking hand in hand, imbued with the common purpose of changing preventive medicine. I remember whole afternoons discussing the best methodology in the pale sunlight that streamed through the tall windows of the lab. He suggested subtle adjustments to the experimental parameters, provoked heated debates about the reproducibility of the results, a subject I always held in absolute rigor. At first, everything seemed elevated, pure, and full of an enthusiasm that seemed genuine to me. But gradually, something changed. Mark became more calculating, his words measured with almost theatrical precision. During meetings with management, his tone was rehearsed, and his speeches were finely tuned to impress an audience that, until then, seemed oblivious to the complexity underpinning our research. I noticed glances exchanged between him and the hospital director, trivial conversations that hid silent complicities that my previously distracted intuitions now registered with sharpness. And then, there was Sarah, my friend and confidant for years. I saw her smile discreetly at Mark at meetings and evaluation sessions, smiles that were no longer part of our circle. Her distancing didn't happen at once, but slowly, like a curtain closing without warning. It was the forging of alliances, her opportunistic alignment with Mark's rising star. Subtly, we realized that the game I was still trapped in was beginning to change. It was in this context that, reflecting later, I understood that the methodological discussions, which my naive eye understood as normal scientific debates, had been traps, maneuvers that Mark had used to access key information from the project, to build a script that culminated in his personal ascent. The trust I placed in scientific protocols and meetings became a weapon against me. On the silent nights in the lab, while I delved into analyzing thousands of data points, searching for patterns that could be disruptive, Mark worked on another kind of phenomenon, the phenomenon of institutional power. He invested his time building a narrative for management, capturing the right attentions while hiding personal agendas and intentions. The recognition I so desperately craved wasn't based on the technical merit of my research, but on internal politics, on the ability to manipulate facts for personal gain. I had made a crucial mistake. I underestimated the weight of politics and the influence the hospital director held over the academic and scientific merit game. The director, who should have maintained impartiality and ensured fairness, clearly favored Mark. He was an indirect accomplice, ensuring that the official project history was shaped to exalt Mark while I was relegated to oblivion. The realization that the system prioritized opportunism over scientific ethics wasn't just a shock, but a bitter revelation. I understood that the ceremony presenting Mark as the victor wasn't a simple event, but public approval, almost an institutional decree, that merit can be silenced when political and personal interests are at stake. This reflection deepened my understanding of the situation. I knew that confronting this structure would be a tougher battle than any experiment or protocol. It wasn't enough to simply demonstrate scientific truth. I needed a strategy that considered the invisible powers and interests behind the scenes of that institution. I understood the game was no longer just scientific, but political, and that I needed to change my approach. I needed to think like a strategist, detect hidden alliances, assess risks, and plan each step with surgical precision. Emotion, though present, had to be controlled. My weapons were logic and the knowledge I possessed, which no one could take away. As I relived these moments, my determination strengthened. I knew every detail of the project, every piece of data collected, every report generated. The knowledge was mine, and no one could erase that truth. While some celebrated a manufactured victory, I silently prepared my response, guided by the mantra that wouldn't leave me. They forgot the knowledge was mine. This mantra would give me strength for the fight that was beginning. A battle that wouldn't be easy, but one I knew I could win, because I wasn't just fighting for professional recognition, but for justice, for scientific integrity, and for the truth that my hands had crafted with such dedication. So, in that moment of solitude and silence, while the world believed in Mark's triumph, I strengthened myself in the certainty of my real value, the certainty that, in the end, knowledge always prevails. The morning after the ceremony that robbed me of recognition, a clear decision dominated my mind. It was time to unravel each layer of the plot that had been imposed on me without warning. This wasn't an outburst of anger, but a professional obligation, to prove that scientific truth couldn't be erased by political maneuvering. I gathered my original notes, those pages filled with raw data, genetic sequences, protocols, and graphs that I myself had compiled over months. I placed my material side by side with the content Mark had officially presented. Every detail mattered. Curves, parameters, values. Everything was meticulously compared. I quickly noticed significant and manipulated differences, clear traces of tampering done to obscure the real authorship. I knew that, alone, this battle would be virtually impossible. The hospital was consumed by interests that transcended science and protected the guilty. That's when I sought my only loyal ally, Dr. Paul, a colleague from the biotechnology lab, known for his unwavering ethics and technical skill. He readily agreed to help. Together, we deepened our analysis, not only of the scientific data, but also of internal documents, emails, memos, and hospital files that Paul accessed in his position. Gradually, we built a clear map of the connections involving Mark, the director, and Sarah. The presence of these documents revealed a well-orchestrated conspiracy of misappropriation of merit. Among the silent rooms and busy corridors of the hospital, my presence became furtive, almost invisible. I observed brief meetings, whispered conversations between Mark and Sarah, moments of apprehension that betrayed fear and perhaps the awareness that they were being investigated. Sarah, who had once been my confidant, now collaborated in omissions and manipulations. The bureaucracy tried to hinder our work. Official requests for minutes and reports met with resistance, appearing with flaws, gaps, or incomplete versions. But this only strengthened my suspicions. We found records that clearly suggested manipulations in the final reports and decisions made without proper record of my participation. By cross-referencing scientific and administrative data, the pieces began to fall into place. There was, indeed, a premeditated editing of the documents to discredit my work while unjustly exalting Mark. Furthermore, we tracked suspicious alterations in signatures and dates, digitally manipulated to mask authorship. Each discovery fueled my sense of urgency. Time was against me. It was vital that we gather solid, irrefutable evidence before the official narrative could further consolidate. I had to forge a dossier with palpable, irrefutable proof that would shake the foundations of the scheme. I remained cool in the midst of the storm. I meticulously calculated each move, ensuring that no crucial detail escaped my notice. The slightest mistake could seal my definitive defeat and forever bury the justice I sought. The collaboration with Paul was also fundamental to accessing internal hospital systems. There we could monitor suspicious movements of documents, duplicate copies, and altered versions. He applied advanced digital analysis methods to detect alterations, fabricated authorship schemes to mislead. As we collected evidence, an invisible armor built up within me. This wasn't just a personal battle against Mark and his allies, but a fight for the integrity of science in an environment corroded by self-interest and internal politics. The madness of it all seemed to dissipate in the solitude of the cold hospital corridors, where I became a vigilant shadow, sleepless in the pursuit of truth. What they had taken from me, the credit, the authorship, the honor, I would rebuild with evidence. At that decisive moment, I made a pact with myself. The story would not end with silence and injustice, because ultimately one certainty could never be stolen or erased: the knowledge, which was and always would be mine. Thus began the next chapter of this fight, a journey where method, patience, and precision would be the weapons to restore not only my name, but also justice for all who believe in scientific truth. The investigation couldn't be restricted to what we had already discovered. The turnaround demanded diving even deeper into that web of interests and manipulations, revealing the true extent of the conspiracy within the hospital and the ties that sustained Mark's position as the false protagonist of our research. Each document, each line of code, each message exchange needed to be dissected with the eyes of a molecular biologist, seeking to find the inconsistencies, the flaws, the biomarkers of fraud. With Dr. Paul's support, the analysis of internal communications became a meticulous operation. Using advanced software, we cross-referenced metadata, times, senders, and recipients of emails, detecting patterns previously invisible. We observed an intense flow of messages between Mark, the director, and Sarah in the weeks following the submission of the preliminary data. The content of these clandestine exchanges was more revealing than any official report. Discussions on how to adjust research credits, plans to suppress my contribution in presentations and documents, instructions to omit my signature on scientific articles. Even more alarming was the finding of the direct involvement of senior management, not only overlooking the mistakes, but actively guiding Mark's actions to consolidate his image. The hospital director, a figure until then respected and seemingly neutral, revealed a ruthless and pragmatic side. He knew he had the power to decide who would rise and who would be invisible, and he had opted for the politics of selective ostracism, to push away those who were inconvenient, to reward those who suited him. The technological analysis also allowed us to open a door to the strategies used to camouflage the real authorship of the research. Digital documents had their versions altered in series, with superimposed layers of modifications, as if they were cuts in genetic sequences, disguising the true origin of the data. This manipulation required high-level technical knowledge, and it was evident that Mark and his allies had internal support, people who dominated the system and were willing to alter records to maintain the deception. Sarah, in turn, had a more subtle but equally crucial role. Her apparent neutrality in public hid the silent work of undermining my reputation behind the scenes. The messages she exchanged with Mark indicated that she was responsible for controlling narratives in research groups, influencing opinions, and isolating me professionally. Her change of attitude was not accidental, but part of a well-calibrated plan to create an unfavorable environment for my return. During this process, I remained a shadow, invisible but attentive to the risks lurking at any carelessness. Every step I took required precise calculation, as the hospital already showed signs of a siege. Confidential reports alerted me to changes in access to files, strange movements in the teams, attempts to keep me away from research meetings. The pressure was mounting, but my conviction was unwavering. It was during these weeks that I delved into the use of new digital data extraction techniques. Using my experience in biotechnology and biomedical data analysis, I developed my own system to track changes in files, a digital sequencing that allowed me to identify the original chain of authorship and its alterations, similar to how we map genetic mutations. It was a perfect analogy. The fraud in my research reflected a corrupted code, and I had the tools to decipher it. In parallel, I began to consolidate an organized archive, a solid and accessible database where all the evidence was stored with secure backups. I knew that this would be my shield when the time came to confront the system. Each file was categorized, each email and document linked to a timeline that showed the progression of the conspiracy. It was a network of evidence that, if dismantled carelessly, could lose strength, so I kept everything as protected as a high biosecurity laboratory. Amidst this complexity, the strategy took shape. It was essential to maintain discretion and to paralyze, from within, the plans of Mark and his accomplices. Therefore, I created digital alerts and audit routines to monitor any suspicious alterations in sensitive documents. It was a race against time and against those who commanded the backstage of the institution. However, it was not just about technology and bureaucracy. I recognized that, to triumph, I needed to understand the human motivations behind that plot. Mark sought status and recognition. The director prioritized financial and political interests, while Sarah wanted professional advancement, even if it meant being complicit in injustice. Understanding this triad of interests allowed me to anticipate their movements and structure my response. Finally, it was clear. Even immersed in this complex network, I remained the sole holder of the original knowledge. The true value resided in the authenticity of the data, in the solid foundation of the research I had built. And despite all the tricks, this scientific methodological truth was immune to political manipulations. During these weeks of in-depth investigation, while they believed they had isolated me, I consolidated my evidence and my silent strength. It was a game of patience, discretion, and strategic intelligence, a silent battle fought in laboratories and keyboards, where each discovery was a step towards the restitution of what they had stolen. They, with arrogance, thought that the mastery of appearances guaranteed them victory. I knew that the true control was in the knowledge, in that set of impeccably produced data faithful to the evidence. And that was the basis of my return, the core of my private justice. They forgot the knowledge was mine. And I, patiently and implacably, was ready to prove it. As the international conference approached, a silent tension dominated my daily life. It was the calm before the storm. the quiet that precedes the hour of exposing truths hidden in shadows of manipulation and veiled interests. Everything I had prepared, the data, the documents, the digital evidence, needed to be impeccable, formatted into a coherent, precise, unbeatable narrative. Nothing could withstand scrutiny. It was time to transform months of investigation and silence into a revelation that would be impossible to ignore. For weeks, I worked tirelessly to construct each slide, outline the flow of the presentation, and choose the words and images that would translate the scientific complexity into clear, persuasive, and accessible language. My audience wouldn't just be the specialists, but also the attending authorities, journalists, and the entire scientific community that depended on integrity to move forward. I needed to show that this research, falsely attributed to Mark, was the fruit of my hard work, of the precise sequencing of the biomarkers I created, true beacons illuminating the path of preventive medicine. Each discrepancy in the data presented by Mark was carefully illustrated. Like a molecular biologist unraveling a mutation, I showed the alterations in the genetic sequence of the results, the various fraudulent versions of the reports, and the forged signatures that attempted to erase my authorship. The exposure of the collusion between Mark, Sarah, and the hospital director was meticulously supported by email exchanges, hidden meetings, and the orchestration to silence my voice and transform merit into illusion. Not only the technical exposure, but also the emotional strategy I saved for the moment of the presentation. I knew Mark would try to destabilize me with veiled attacks, criticisms of my character, and questions about my competence. I prepared firm responses, based on logic and irrefutable evidence. Every word I spoke had the coolness of science combined with the force of a truth no one could deny. On the day of the conference, the hall was packed. Renowned researchers, influential authorities, journalists, all eyes were on that stage where I assumed the role of victim and whistleblower. I was greeted with curious and, in some cases, skeptical looks, but my voice broke the silence firmly, each phrase genuine and confident. As I revealed the evidence, I perceived the change in the atmosphere, murmurs of surprise, expressions of disbelief, sympathetic and tense gazes crossing. Mark was there, in the audience, trying to maintain his composure. His vanity and arrogance couldn't hide the discomfort now reflected on his features. Even when he tried to interrupt, his voice was drowned out by my implacable stance and the revelation that admitted no contestation. The climax of my presentation was the exposure of the detailed timeline of the scheme, the falsifications in the reports, the director's strategies to favor Mark, and Sarah's secondary but decisive role in the exclusion of my contribution. The absolute silence that followed was more eloquent than any applause. At that moment, it was clear to everyone that the mask of impunity had finally fallen. After the conference, the impact of the revelation reverberated immediately. The hospital, which previously seemed invincible in its policy of silence and complicity, found itself forced to confront the truth that could no longer be hidden. Internal investigations were opened, scientific committees demanded revisions, and the prestige built by Mark began to crumble slowly. More importantly, the international scientific community became aware of the magnitude of the injustice and the danger represented by institutional connivance to the advancement of genuine science. My presentation was not just a denunciation, it was a manifesto for ethics, transparency, and respect for shared knowledge. At that moment, I felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. I knew that this symbolic victory was only the beginning of a larger process, a reconstruction that would require patience, resilience, and the constant defense of the truth. Even so, as I left the hall, the mantra that had accompanied me since the beginning of that journey gained even more weight. They forgot the knowledge was mine. And I knew that from then on, nobody could erase what I had established. My justice was on the march, and no shadow would be able to hide the light of my work. The restoration of my name, my honor, and scientific integrity began there, firm, solid, and implacable. The true revolution, silent and potent, was only beginning. When I left the conference, I carried with me a mix of relief and strengthened determination. I knew that moment was decisive, that the mask of impunity had finally been torn, but I was also aware that the battle for justice was far from over. The public exposure of the fraud and conspiracy within the hospital had opened the doors to a turbulent period of consequences and internal confrontations, which would demand more resilience and focus than I had imagined. The hospital, previously imposing in its policy of silence and complicity, was beginning to feel the weight of the truth. There was a muffled but persistent rumor of the changes that were coming. The senior management, pressured by the irrefutable evidence, found itself obliged to establish an independent commission to officially investigate the accusations I had presented. This commission brought together members of the internal scientific committees of the hospital, as well as external representatives invited to guarantee impartiality and transparency. I was called to deliver my official dossier, a rigorous compilation of the evidence collected over months, original reports, altered versions, digital records, emails implicating Mark and Sarah, and the complicit involvement of the director. In those meetings, I felt the tension pulsating like a vital organ, as discussions alternated between subtle confrontations and heavy silences. Mark still tried to maintain the posture of innocence, using strategies to disqualify my work. He questioned my history, sought to insinuate technical errors as a way to cast doubt on my evidence. Sarah hovered in the shadows, trying to undermine my credibility with whispers, fleeting glances, and small, indirect attacks, subtle traps common in internal political battles. I, however, maintained the balance of calculated coolness. Every argument he launched, I dismantled with irrefutable fragments of data. Our dispute was not just an exchange of words, but a clash between scientific ethics and the manipulation of power. In all the meetings, I was strategic, patient, always ready to respond to the attacks with solid foundations, responding to arrogance with the force of facts. Outside these tense encounters, the pressure was expanding throughout the institution. The specialized press began covering the case, and the international scientific community expressed its solidarity, demanding that the truth be ensured and that measures be taken to defend the integrity of research and science. The hospital, now in the spotlight, attempted to maneuver to mitigate the impact, but its days of impunity were numbered. The turning point came when the committee, after weeks of exhaustive analysis of the evidence, issued a conclusive report. The credit for the research belonged to me. Mark was declared responsible for document fraud and misappropriation of credit. Sarah had actively participated in the conspiracy to exclude my authorship. The hospital director was accused of complicity and ethical negligence. The recommendations included an official public retraction, a review of the awarded titles, and disciplinary sanctions for those involved. The hospital had no choice but to comply with the decisions. In a low-key ceremony, my official rehabilitation was carried out. The recognition that had previously been denied to me returned not as a trophy, but as a historical correction. Mark and Sarah were dismissed and faced internal proceedings, while the director saw his influence undermined, relegated to political isolation within the institution. Although the results were gratifying, the journey had left its mark. Those days of intense pressure, constant surveillance, and emotional battles took their toll, draining strength that I had to gradually rebuild. The awareness that winning doesn't always bring immediate peace became one of the most valuable lessons. Over the months, I decided to transform this painful experience into a driving force. I knew that continuing in that environment, corroded by internal politics and betrayals, would be as challenging as fighting against that system. Therefore, I made the decision to take a leap, to found my own startup dedicated to preventive medicine, free from bureaucratic traps and institutional manipulations. Assembling my team was an exercise in careful selection. I invited professionals aligned with the values I had always defended: integrity, transparency, a true focus on innovation and social impact. Our objective was clear: to develop solutions that truly made a difference, based on rigorous science and unquestionable ethics. Every project, every protocol, there was a direct result of my expertise and passion for discovery. The path to that point taught me that science is made with money, talent, and firmness of character. but also with the courage to confront systems that try to stifle those who dare to innovate genuinely. What differentiated me was not only technical knowledge, but the conviction and tenacity to defend what is right. Looking back, I don't see bitterness, but a transformed relationship with difficulties. Each scar resulting from betrayal was a lesson in strength, each momentary defeat an impulse for firmer restarts. Today, I walk the path of preventive medicine with the tranquility of those who know their truth is unshakable. And so I continue my journey, with renewed hope and the unbreakable determination of someone who knows that knowledge, their greatest asset, can never be forgotten or stolen. They forgot the knowledge was mine, and I will never forget that. Nor will I allow it to happen again. The moment of the official launch of my startup symbolized more than a professional advancement. It was a consecration of my resilience. After facing betrayals, manipulations, and injustices, I finally took control of my destiny, with a clear team and purpose, to transform preventive medicine through ethical and innovative science. As I presented our mission, I felt the strength of every battle fought. I spoke about pioneering protocols that combine artificial intelligence with genetic data to anticipate diseases and personalize treatments. I showed with enthusiasm how each development would be inspired by the integrity and scientific truth I recovered after the storm. Observing the reaction of those present, many with stories and dreams similar to mine, filled me with hope. Among investors and young researchers, a collective desire to change a system that has so often silenced legitimate voices was awakened. My personal story became a manifesto against corruption and arrogance within science, a warning that merit and ethics can never be set aside. The true victory, however, was not in that symbolic act, but in the daily construction of the projects. With my dedicated and aligned team, we were forging the path of responsible innovation. It was an environment where talent and effort had real value, without the shadows of favoritism or ulterior motives. Each success, each advance in preventive medicine reinforced the importance of preserving knowledge with justice, and I walked without bitterness, only with the unshakable conviction of someone who won the most difficult battle, that of keeping the truth alive in a world that often tries to hide it. They forgot the knowledge was mine. But now, my strong and clear voice echoes so that no one will forget again the value of scientific integrity. This is the apex of my journey. Not a full stop, but a constant, firm, and implacable construction.